earlier I spoke to Sir Simon Mayall, who's the former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff. He's an author, he's a soldier, he's written a fascinating book called Soldier in the Sand, and he gave a really interesting perspective on some of the reports that we've seen in today's newspapers, including one on the front of the Mail on Sunday, which basically indicates that the British hasn't got the military capability to take over from the Germans when it comes to leading a military task force. This is what he had to say.
Well, it's a very disappointing headline, but it's not surprising. You'll remember, Camilla, just recently, a source said that our American friends, who we have always judged ourselves as the peer exemplar by, said that you're no longer a first-tier army. I joined an army of 165,000, 1,000 tanks, etc. And I'm not saying quantity is everything by any means. Technology moves on, but I think for those in the army, those in defence, those who care about the army, who care about defence, will be very disappointed to read a headline like that.
Let's have a look at some of the statistics. When you say, 160,000, now we have troops that have been cut significantly. The number of tanks has gone from 227. That's going to be cut further by 79 to come down to 148. In 1990, we had 1,200. The Royal Navy's fleet is more than half the size it was in the 1980s. The RAF has got half the number of active aircraft that it had in 2006. This will make people think, are we even in a position to be supplying these British fighter jets to Ukraine, as President Zelensky requested in Westminster Hall on Wednesday?
Well, it's a cumulative effect of almost back from the fall of the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall coming down. The successive governments have taken a peace dividend. They're not the only ones. The French have done it, although they've spent money, I think, better than we have. The Germans have certainly done it, which is why part of the problem we have in going around the world, demonstrating our intent and our expertise. British Armed Forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, are all full of highly capable men and women. There are some very good capabilities, but, quantity does have a quality of its own. And we've continually taken risk against this. And an organisation has breadth, but it also has depth in terms of ammunition, stocks and spares, supplies, etc. And those have all been, we've taken at risk. And at the end of the day, any British government should be very embarrassed that there is a headline of, we look at ourselves as a lead member of NATO, embarrassed that we appear to not be able to take up our position on a rotation from the Germans, who we're often very critical about in terms of their commitment to defence spending.
What do you put this down to, though? A degree of complacency since the Gulf War? This idea, well, actually, we don't need to defend ourselves on land anymore. Let's move our capability more in a cyber direction?
Yes, well, even Boris Johnson, he's often quoted, he sits there saying, I think you'll find, the days of tanks sweeping across, Central Europe are long over now. And, all of us sort of said, yes, we get cyber. There are a range of threats we need to, protect against: intelligence, Chinese balloons, you name it.
Yes.
Cyber really important, an awful lot in the technological sphere. But at a certain level, you just find you can't do a rotation, you can't do a scale that makes your allies assume that you are the first port of call, which for the Americans was always the British. And also within that, you then begin to have recruitment problems because people don't want to join an organisation that looks like it's shrinking. Got retention problems because the very best think, well, I'm no longer in part of an organisation that looks like it's got a healthy future. And so you get into a downward spiral. And somewhere along the line, if we really are serious about Britain's place in the world, and I feel very passionately about that, and we've got huge responsibilities, great influence, and we leverage off our military prowess, as I say, in all sorts of other regions. We need to do a regain. It does go back to the economy. I know there are priorities.
We also read today that the inflationary effect on our defences has been enormous. There's now talk of a £10 billion deal needed to try and up some of the capabilities that we already have. Now, if Rishi Sunak doesn't stick to Liz Truss's 3% of GDP commitment, is he going to look unserious when he comes to defending the country?
I think he is when everybody looks at... We're about to have a Russian offensive, I think, in Ukraine. That will set the conditions for what NATO does and how the West responds to Putin about the success or otherwise of that offensive, whether we want to do more. But ultimately, we are falling into the category that we used to criticise other NATO allies of being able to talk a good talk politically. But actually, the military chiefs, God bless them, who have to wrestle with this every day, going into the the defence section, saying there isn't anything we can handle. And we've given away a hell of a lot, quite rightly. But I see no evidence that the Treasury is releasing funds to build back stocks, particularly of ammunition. And that will come up time and again. It's not simply the tank and the crew. It is absolutely the weaponry that goes on a plane and a ship on a tank that turn it into a capability. And we've taken huge risk against that. And all the NLAWs and the like that have gone, all the 155mm ammunition, the guns. And it's no good providing the guns or the tanks if you haven't got the ammunition to go with them.
I mean, have we got enough ammunition should there be an invasion on UK soil?
Well, I couldn't speculate, and I'm not in the game, but I fear, because I was in the game long enough, that it's always a very easy thing to take risk against. And you think I can go out on the market. I mean, we did it, to be honest. It was the big debate in the first Gulf War, which I took part in, where we went to our Belgian friends and said, could you provide us with ammunition? And that's one of the joys of everybody having
Yes.
commonality of ammunition. But the reality is, at the end of the day, you need a sovereign capability. But it is difficult to just turn it on.
Yes.
And I think what the war in Ukraine has shown us is just how costly, in terms of manpower and ammunition and equipment, a full-blooded conventional war is.
Apart from problems with procurement and some deals just not working out to be economically viable or indeed good value for money for the taxpayer, we've also had this issue with aircraft carriers not working adequately. We've got the HMS Prince of Wales suffering repeated problems, being dry docked, only being used for just 267 days, despite £3.2 billion having been spent on it. I mean, what's going on there?
Well, again, it's a tragedy. It's disappointing. It's not surprising. It's a highly capable aircraft carrier, but it was a huge announcements. We have these two global class aircraft carriers. It looks embarrassing. I think it's disappointing for the head of the Navy. I think it's disappointing, obviously, for the Chief of Defence Staff. The problem with big equipment is, of course, there's inflation built in. So you can say, well, we'll give you inflation, but defence equipment inflation is always higher than underlying inflation. There's always cost overruns, as we know. The Army have been, I'm not going to use the word scandalous, were last given a major project, Ajax, and that's proving to be a disaster. So we've taken, again, all sorts of risk against capabilities. So the CGS at the moment, we're looking at the money spent on carriers, the money spent on F-35s, and then looking at the money that was given to him or his predecessors.
Yes.
And worrying that we're just not getting the bang for the buck that we should get from the investment, even before we build back stocks from what we've expended in Ukraine and move forward on that sort of Liz Truss aspiration.
Let's talk about Ukraine. I mean, what did you make of President Zelensky's request for these planes? I'll take your tea, but I want your planes, please. And do you think that we should be providing air support?
Yes, I do. The reality is, it's very complex. Even giving a tank or an artillery piece is complex. To make it into a capability, you've got to train it, you've got to supply it, you've got to support it, you've got to have the ammunition, etc. The difficulty with an aircraft is the weapon system. If you're a fast jet pilot, flying another fast jet is, to an extent, a bit like driving a Morris and picking up a Bentley. It's broadly there. But actually, the integration of the weapon system is different. So my feeling is, at the moment, that the answer, a bit like for the tanks, is the Leopard 2. The answer is probably the F-16,
yes,
rather than the Typhoon.
Because they're a bit too sophisticated.
They probably are.
They require too much training.
And they're quadripartite. You need the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish.
Yeah.
That'd be a good demonstration of NATO intent.
It takes a while to train pilots on these aircraft, surely.
And as I say, I think, as we were saying earlier on, Camilla, I think the context of the debate will be set by what happens with the Russian offensive, which we're assuming Putin is building up for, and we, as again you well know, next week is the first anniversary of that. They're crossing the border to try and do that coup de main and kill Zelensky and overthrow the government in Kyiv.
Briefly, Sir Simon, how do you see this ending?
Well, not well for anybody, really. I mean, this is the danger. It's very difficult to see anything that doesn't give us another set of very difficult problems. What we don't want, of course, is a Ukrainian defeat. But it is very difficult if the Russians are determined to continue to sacrifice reputation, blood, treasure, how we're going to throw them out of the Donbass Luhansk and Donetsk and Luhansk. Unless, of course, we do find that the Russian army will refuse to fight. And if the Ukrainians can continue to take the fight, absorb a Russian offensive, break the back of the Russian army, well, history is littered with political change in Russia as a result of military defeat on the battlefield.
Sir Simon Mayall, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Camilla.